In the kitchen, the sole noise was the metallic tap of Richard's spoon on the side of his coffee cup. Sunlight streamed through the window, gentle and uncaring, illuminating the room but failing to reach the void that separated us. Following 4 decades of shared life, our silence had evolved into a distinct language, one that was pointed, weighty, and deeply known. I was seated opposite him, my hands clasped in my lap, bracing for the words he had evidently been mustering the courage to deliver. When he finally spoke, his tone was disarmingly casual. Speaking candidly, he began, his gaze focused on the vapor rising from his mug. "My regret is having married you." There was no trace of anger, no hint of hesitation. It was delivered as a simple declaration of fact. I remained silent. I posed no questions about why, or for how long he had harbored this sentiment. I just stayed seated, as every other noise in existence seemed to fade away until only his words resonated in my mind. "I regret marrying you." A small, resilient light within me, one that had persisted through countless quiet letdowns, wavered for a moment before extinguishing completely. I rose from my chair slowly, using the table's edge to steady myself. My voice would have failed me, even if I had attempted to speak. Upstairs, our bedroom appeared untouched. The bed was perfectly made, his cufflinks rested in their tray near the mirror, and my robe was on its hook behind the door. Yet it all felt like a foreign space, as if I were wandering through an exhibit of another person's existence. 40 years of routine, of concessions, of convincing myself that love was a constant, even in its quietest forms. I opened the wardrobe and pulled out the suitcase that had been unused for so long. A thin layer of dust coated its zipper. Each of my actions felt measured and intentional. Fold, inhale, fold once more. This wasn't an escape. It was simply me, ceasing to move forward on this path. I packed meticulously, not with any thought of returning, but out of a lingering respect for what our union once represented. As I reached for my diary, the single repository of my unspoken truths, I paused. That small journal contained everything I had never voiced, every indignity I had framed as patience, every concession made simply to maintain harmony, every instance I had suppressed my own pain and labeled it love. For an instant, I contemplated bringing it with me. Then, I decided against it. I carefully placed it inside the nightstand drawer. Perhaps it was meant to stay here, within this house filled with unresolved dialogues and incompletely lived years. When I returned to the ground floor, Richard remained at the table, his eyes still lost in his coffee. He didn't inquire about my destination. He made no effort to dissuade me. His utter stillness communicated everything. For him, this was far simpler than acknowledging what had been absent between us for so long. I took my keys and exited the house without making a sound. The air outside was cool, the sunlight bright and impassive. I had imagined the world might seem altered now that my own had fractured, but it was unchanged. Cars drove by. A dog barked in the distance. Someone, somewhere, was laughing. The world does not halt for a broken heart. It carries on. I didn't slam the door. I left no letter. I simply departed with all that I required and nothing that I did not. The reality was that I had been unknowingly preparing for this moment. It showed in the way I had begun to sleep further on my side of the bed, the way I had ceased putting out 2 mugs for coffee, the way I had taught myself to fill the quiet with minor noises, music, the hum of the dishwasher, anything to drown out the reminder that he and I no longer communicated in any meaningful way. When I had first met Richard, he was not a cruel or thoughtless man. He was the sort of person who provided a sense of security. He was stable, dependable, and perpetually in command. I was 22 at the time, brimming with hopeful notions and a belief in forever. He was 25, already managing his father's hardware store, the type of man who never missed paying a bill or remembering a birthday. I mistook that stability for love. Perhaps, in the beginning, it was. We were married in the springtime. He crafted our dining room table with his own hands. I wore a dress borrowed from my sister. Our means were modest, but we had what we needed. I resigned from my job after our daughter, Grace, was born, and did so again with the arrival of our son, Daniel. I convinced myself it was not a sacrifice but an act of love. This was the expected path for a woman. Richard put in long days at work, and I managed the household. We settled into the rhythm of a quiet machine dedicated to sustaining life, raising children, paying mortgages, keeping occupied. For many years, that was sufficient. I was the maker of Sunday pancakes, the matcher of socks, the keeper of birthdays, the packer of lunches. He was the one who filled my car with gas before a storm and replaced the light bulbs I couldn't get to. He was reliable, and I confused that reliability with affection. But reliability is not the same as intimacy. At some point, the small gestures ceased to carry their original weight. We no longer brushed against each other in the hallway, no longer shared spontaneous laughter, no longer truly saw one another. We were merely coexisting, like two bookends supporting a narrative that had long since concluded. When the children moved out, I held on to the hope that we might finally reconnect. Perhaps we would travel, start a garden, or learn how to be a couple once more. Instead, the silence between us grew more profound. Richard filled his with the noise of news channels and the order of spreadsheets. I filled mine with household tasks, new recipes, and a persistent hope. I told myself that all marriages endure such phases, that love simply transforms over time. What I failed to grasp was that it could become completely hollow while maintaining its outward appearance. So when he finally uttered those words, "I regret marrying you," it wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation. The conclusion had already arrived, he had just finally given it a title. That evening, I drove without any particular place in mind. The roads became a blur, the radio provided a low hum, and my thoughts turned to all the years I had dedicated to trying to merit something that ought to have been given without condition. Love, respect, a partnership. The anger hadn't surfaced yet, it would visit me later. For the moment, I felt only a profound emptiness, the feeling of a woman who had confused endurance with love and had at last understood the distinction. By the time I pulled over for gas at the town's edge, the sun was descending. I saw my own reflection in the station window, tired eyes, a faint trace of smudged mascara, a woman I hardly knew. I didn't appear broken, merely finished, and perhaps that in itself was a new start. The dissolution of a marriage, I realized, doesn't happen suddenly. It unfolds in minuscule, nearly imperceptible steps, the slow chilling of warmth, the quiet forgetting of how to connect. I once believed a breakup was about shouting, crying, and slamming doors. But that wasn't our way. Richard's and my ending was a quieter affair, more like dust settling after years of ignoring the fractures. I can now trace the decline back to minor events, moments that seemed insignificant then but now stand out as warnings I chose to overlook. It was our 25th wedding anniversary. Grace and Daniel had come into town, and my closest friend, Nora, had assisted me in organizing a small dinner gathering. I chose a blue dress that Richard had once complimented, saying it enhanced the color of my eyes. I styled my hair, lit the candles, and set the table with our wedding china. He returned home late, loosened his tie, grumbled about traffic, and gave me a perfunctory kiss on the cheek without making eye contact. Throughout the meal, he was his typical charming self, discussing his work, his golf partners, and the state of the economy. Our guests laughed. I smiled. Yet during the entire evening, he failed to mention me even once. Not our union, not the years we had spent together, not the home I had carefully constructed around his extended workdays and weary silences. When Nora lifted her glass to toast us, to 25 years and still going strong, everyone applauded. Richard got to his feet, offered a slight shrug, and remarked, "Well, that's a long time to put up with anyone." The table erupted in laughter. I laughed as well, because that is what one does when one's husband reduces their shared life to a punchline. Later that night, after our friends had departed, I stood washing dishes while he watched television. I felt an urge to ask him what he'd truly meant by his joke, but I already sensed the answer. It hadn't been a joke at all. It was a truth he no longer felt the need to conceal. Following that evening, the small slights became more frequent. He began to cut me off mid-sentence, completing my thoughts with inaccurate, half-heard assumptions. He stopped inquiring about my day. Whenever I attempted to share something I was enthusiastic about, a book, a new dish, a story from Nora, he would offer a polite smile and say, "You always get so worked up over these things." At a neighborhood gathering, a guest asked me how I occupied my time now that the children were grown. Before I could form a response, Richard interjected with a laugh, "She's essentially a professional worrier." The man chuckled, and he added, "Can't stay still for a minute." I smiled and feigned that the comment didn't hurt, but internally, something changed. It was the first quiet fissure in my sense of self-respect. He never raised his hand to me. He never shouted. In truth, that might have been more straightforward. Instead, his withdrawal was gradual, an inch at a time, until I found myself standing entirely alone in the area where our marriage had once existed. He ceased preparing my coffee in the morning. He stopped bidding me good night. He no longer waited for me to be seated before starting his dinner. Initially, I maintained these routines, hoping they might draw him back in, cooking his favorite meals, laying out his folded shirts, planning birthday surprises. I believed that love could be reignited with enough patience. But patience devolved into silence, and silence became a mode of survival. I can still vividly recall the first morning he poured only a single cup of coffee. He didn't even seem aware of it, just stirred his mug, browsed his phone, and left for the day. I stood at the counter, gazing at the empty second cup I had set out from habit. That was the day I resumed writing in my diary. At first, my entries were simple, brief observations. He forgot my birthday. He's working late again. He called me too sensitive. Over time, it transformed into something more, a chronicle of his absence, a detailed account of a slow disappearance. I wrote because speaking was no longer effective. I wrote to assure myself that I was still present, still tangible, still able to experience emotions beyond disappointment. Grace perceived very little. Her phone calls were mostly filled with stories about her own children and her busy schedule. Daniel would send a message now and then, brief texts, a picture of his dog, always concluding with, "Love you, Mom." I held on to those messages as if they were lifelines. But I never confided in them about what was truly happening. I didn't want to appear fragile, or even worse, overly dramatic. Richard often described our life as comfortable. I guess that is one way to put it. Comfortable, like a well-worn shoe that has shaped itself around every sore spot until the pain is no longer felt. I continued to believe it was just a phase, that after so many years, couples naturally fall into quiet patterns. That perhaps love evolves into routine, into silence. But the reality is that silence is not synonymous with peace. It is decay masquerading as tranquility. One Sunday morning, I made pancakes as I always did. He came downstairs several hours later, already in his golf attire, with his phone held to his ear. I mentioned that breakfast was on the table. He replied, "Don't hold up for me." And I didn't. I sat at the dining table by myself and ate the food I had prepared, for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The house was so still I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. I found myself wondering just how many years I had confused a sense of duty with genuine affection. By that point, I had ceased to cry over it. One cannot mourn something that fades away so gradually. Your system adapts, absorbing the loss like it's the very air you breathe. So, I discovered alternate ways to manage. I joined a book club, began volunteering at the local library, and planted an herb garden. I filled my days with small endeavors, little points of focus to remind myself that life was indeed still unfolding. Yet every night, as I switched off the lights and lay down beside him, I felt it, the void, the insurmountable gap between two individuals lying just inches from each other. Once, I whispered, "Good night." He gave no reply. He was not asleep, I was certain of it. The following night, I too remained silent. And thus, the silence grew into a barrier that we both learned to exist behind. The most isolating aspect wasn't the feeling of being overlooked. It was the realization of how effortless it was for him, how seamlessly my erasure was accomplished. I started to diminish myself without even being aware of it, my voice growing softer, my requests fewer, my presence taking up less and less space. I told myself this was me being understanding, but that wasn't true. It was just me becoming invisible. One afternoon, I stood before the mirror in the hallway, adjusting my blouse before heading out to meet Nora for coffee. I saw my reflection and failed to recognize the woman looking back. It wasn't because she was older, although she was, but because she seemed so adept at disappearing. That was the day I wrote in my journal, "He doesn't need to leave me to make me feel alone. He only has to continue being himself." Reflecting on it now, I see that as the moment the marriage truly died. It wasn't the morning he confessed his regret. That was merely the aftershock. The true end had come years before, in all the quiet instances when I began to fade away, and he never even took notice. It was a brilliant spring morning, the kind that ought to have inspired hope, the kind that once did. I had dedicated the entire week to planning a family brunch. Grace was coming with her husband and children. Daniel was flying in for the weekend. It had been months since we were all together, and I was determined to make it feel special. Not solely for their sake, but for my own. I needed a reminder that the life I had so carefully constructed still held meaning. I rose at dawn, baked blueberry muffins from scratch, arranged fresh flowers on the table, ironed the linen napkins, and used the fine china. Each small detail felt significant. I convinced myself this gathering could be like it was before the silences, before the chasm between us. Richard descended the stairs late, already clad in his golf shirt. He didn't lift his eyes from his phone as I wished him good morning. "I made your favorite quiche," I offered, my voice straining for cheerfulness. He poured himself a glass of orange juice. "Didn't we have that last year?" The question landed like a small, hard pebble. "It's Grace's favorite," I replied gently. He just shrugged. "If you say so." The doorbell chimed before I could say more. Grace swept in first, a whirlwind of rushed energy and brief embraces, her children scattering around her. Daniel was next, a broad smile on his face as he enveloped me in a genuine hug that nearly brought me to tears. He still wore the same faint scent of aftershave from his college days. For a brief instant, I allowed myself to think that everything was all right. We all sat down to eat. The table was alive with voices, with activity, with everything that had been so noticeably absent. I tried to soak it all in, the laughter, the sound of silverware on plates, Grace's children arguing over the maple syrup. For those few minutes, I felt like I belonged to something again. Then Grace took a bite of a muffin and grimaced. "Mom, these are a bit dry. Did you use a different recipe?" Her tone wasn't malicious, just thoughtless. But it struck a very raw nerve. "No," I said quietly. "It's the same recipe I always use." Grace furrowed her brow. "That's odd. Maybe it's your oven." Before I could respond, Richard let out a chuckle. "She's always had a knack for overcomplicating things." Everyone at the table laughed, Grace included. I held my smile in place, my grip tightening on the napkin in my lap. Then Richard continued, in the manner he so often did. "Remember the time she baked Daniel's birthday cake and left out the sugar?" Daniel gave a soft laugh. "I was 6, Dad." "Even so," Richard grinned, "I suspected she was trying to poison me. At least the frosting looked good. Your mother has always been better at effort than execution." The table erupted in laughter once more. I remained seated, smiling as if I were in on the joke, all while feeling a flush of heat creep up my face, the sound of my own pulse drumming in my ears. Their laughter began to blur. I stared down at the floral pattern on my plate until it stopped trembling. It wasn't just his words. It was the casualness of it all, the way they all found it normal to ridicule the woman who had built the very world they inhabited. Daniel's eyes met mine. He must have noticed something in my expression, because he leaned closer and said softly, "The quiche is delicious, Mom." But it was too little, too late. The harm was already done. I excused myself after we finished dessert, murmuring something about checking the coffee. No one tried to stop me. They carried on their conversation, their voices receding as I walked into the kitchen. I stood at the sink, my hands clenched on the countertop's edge, gazing out the window at the garden I had planted 2 decades prior. The flowers were in full bloom, brilliant yellows and whites, entirely oblivious. The sound of their laughter drifted in through the doorway, muffled but still clear. I had spent my entire life trying to make them happy. Every birthday celebration, every late-night load of laundry, every quietly offered apology. And there I was, reduced to a punchline in my own house. Something inside me shifted in that moment. It wasn't a fracture, but more like a door clicking shut. I understood then that they no longer saw me, not as a woman, not even as a person, but merely as a function, someone who could be counted on to cook, to clean, to smile, to absorb. I drew a long, slow breath, turned off the faucet, and dried my hands. That night, long after everyone had gone home, I sat by myself at the very table where they had all laughed. The dishes were cleared, and the candles had burned down to stubs. On his way upstairs, Richard passed behind me and gave my shoulder a light pat. "You did a good job today," he commented. "They seemed to have a nice time." I just nodded. "They did." He offered a faint smile and continued up to bed without another word. I remained there for a long while in the quiet kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the clock. Then I opened my diary, the one I had put away so many times, and wrote a single sentence. "I think I'm done being the joke in my own story." I didn't weep. I didn't feel rage. I only felt a peculiar sense of calm, the kind that settles in when a decision has already been made deep within you. It wasn't the brunch that had broken me. It was what the brunch had laid bare, that I could vanish right in front of them, and not a single one would even notice. 3 weeks later, I started to pack. I didn't tell Richard right away. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been communicated through years of silence. I folded my clothes just as I always had, but this time, it was with a clear purpose. My suitcase gradually filled with favorite sweaters, a handful of books, and a small framed picture of the children from when they were little. When I finally informed him of my plans, he didn't so much as look up from his newspaper. "I'm leaving," I announced. He blinked, just once. "What do you mean?" "I am going to stay with Nora for a while," I clarified. "For what?" he asked. I met his gaze directly. "To remember who I am, because this, whatever this has become, is not a life." He let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "So now you're the victim?" "No," I said softly. "Not any longer." He said nothing more. And that quiet, the very same quiet that had filled our home for countless years, told me everything I needed to know. Nora's house possessed a warmth that mine had lost long ago, not from the thermostat, but from the simple fact that someone there still cared for the atmosphere within it. She didn't press for details when I showed up on her doorstep. She simply took my luggage, pulled me into a tight embrace, and said, "You can stay for as long as you need." Her guest room was small, furnished with a twin bed, a lamp, and a window that captured the light of the late afternoon. The air smelled faintly of lemon-scented detergent and lavender. It was a simple, temporary space. But for the first time in a very long time, it felt like it was mine. That first night, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the suitcase I had yet to unpack. The house was still, but it was not an empty stillness. It was the kind of quiet that made space for breath. For grief. The tears did not come that night. I just felt hollow, as if my life had been scooped out from the center. I wasn't angry with Richard. I wasn't even sad in a way that I could cleanly define. I simply had no idea what to do with myself now that my usefulness to others had ended. I had spent decades functioning on autopilot, meals, chores, holidays, always preparing for the comfort of someone else. And in an instant, there was nothing left to organize. No dinners to prepare, no voice calling my name from a different room, just an expanse of empty space. At first, I tried to fill it. I wiped down Nora's already spotless kitchen counters, refolded laundry that didn't need it, and rearranged her bookshelf twice. She found me doing this once and laughed gently. "You don't have to earn your keep here," she said. But it wasn't about earning my place. It was about finding some measure of control, about imposing order on the profound disorder my life had become. The mornings were the most difficult. I would wake up anticipating the sounds of Richard downstairs, the gurgle of the coffee machine, the murmur of the news on the radio, and then I would remember that I wasn't there anymore. I would lie in bed listening to the birds outside and wonder how a sound so gentle could inflict so much pain. For days after I arrived, I finally broke. It was late, past midnight, and Nora had already gone to bed. I found myself standing in her kitchen, gazing at the window over the sink. The moonlight cast an unfamiliar glow on everything. My hands began to tremble, and I couldn't understand why. I opened the refrigerator, then closed it again. My chest felt tight, not with panic, but as if sorrow had finally settled there. I slid down to the floor, my back pressed against a cabinet, and covered my face with my palms. I didn't sob, it wasn't that kind of crying. It was quieter, tears that just slipped out because they had nowhere else to go. I thought of all the years I had given so willingly, every small kindness, every unspoken sacrifice, and how effortlessly they had all been forgotten. Not with malice, just with carelessness, as if I had been the background music for someone else's life. I thought about the way Richard had said, "I regret marrying you," as if he were returning an item that was past its warranty. I thought of Grace's laughter at the brunch table, and the way Daniel had looked away, his expression one of pity, not cruelty. And I thought, for the very first time, about myself, not as a wife, not as a mother, but as a person who had been quietly starving for acknowledgement. When the tears finally ceased, I felt empty but somehow lighter, as if the worst had already transpired and I had survived it. I made myself a glass of water, drank it slowly, and went back to bed. I didn't sleep soundly, but what rest I got was filled with the kind of restless dreams that feel like the shedding of an old skin. The next morning, I opened my suitcase and unpacked properly. I hung up my clothes, arranged my books on the small dresser, and placed the framed photograph of my children beside the bed. I even set my journal on the nightstand. It wasn't the old one, it was a new one I had bought years ago but had never dared to begin. That day, I wrote, "I don't know who I am when I'm not being useful. But I'm still here." Maybe that's a start. For days, I floated between a state of numbness and small, fleeting moments of clarity. Nora checked on me without being intrusive. She would make tea, or ask if I wanted to go for a walk. Sometimes I would join her. Other times, I just sat by the window and watched the world carry on without me. One rainy afternoon, I discovered an old page from my previous diary tucked inside my handbag, torn and folded, dated October 1993. The ink had faded, but I could still make out the words. "I think Richard still loves me, but I miss being looked at. Not just seen, but truly seen." I told him I was tired, and he said I worry too much. Maybe I do. But I just want to feel held, not managed. I stared at that line for a long time. 30 years had elapsed, and nothing had changed. I had been waiting for the same kind of love that my younger self had already identified as slipping away. That night, I opened my new journal again and wrote, "I spent decades waiting for someone to notice I was disappearing. I think it's time I start noticing myself." It wasn't hope yet. Hope felt too bright, too far off. But it was awareness, and awareness, I have learned, is where healing begins. In the weeks that followed, I started to move differently, slowly, and with care. I went with Nora to the grocery store simply to get out of the house. The first time I walked alone down the baking aisle, I felt a strange pang of freedom. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't planning a meal for anyone else. I was just being. When the cashier smiled and complimented my scarf, I smiled back, a real smile. The foreignness of the feeling startled me. At night, when the house grew quiet, I sometimes found myself afraid, not of being alone, but of the realization of how much of my life had been spent trying to avoid it. There is a strange kind of grief in discovering how little space you have taken up in your own story. But with each passing day, the silence began to soften. It stopped feeling like a punishment and started to feel like a possibility. I wasn't healed. I wasn't brave. I was just awake, for the first time in a very long time. Healing did not happen all at once. It arrived in small, almost forgettable moments. The first morning I woke up without a feeling of dread. The first time I hummed while preparing tea. The first time I looked at my own reflection and did not flinch. The change was so gradual that I almost missed it. One morning, I awoke before sunrise. Nora had already left for her early yoga class, and the house was still. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the kitchen window, watching the sky shift from indigo to a soft gold. Something inside of me loosened. I realized I was breathing more deeply, no longer waiting for something to hurt. That same day, I decided to walk to the corner store alone. I didn't need anything in particular, I just wanted to be in motion. The air was cool, the sidewalks damp from the previous night's rain. I passed a group of children waiting for the school bus, a woman watering her plants, a man jogging with his dog, all ordinary things. But to me, it felt extraordinary, this simple act of moving through the world without anyone expecting me to be somewhere else. At the store, I bought strawberries, a new pen, and a small notebook, another one. The cashier, a young girl with chipped blue nail polish, smiled and said, "Pretty scarf." "Thank you," I replied. It had been so long since anyone had noticed anything about me that I almost teared up right there. When I returned home, I opened the notebook and wrote 3 sentences. I'm still here. I'm learning how to live without waiting for permission. I think I'm starting to like the quiet. Nora noticed the difference before I did. "You're sitting differently," she said one evening over dinner. I laughed. "Sitting?" She nodded. "Your shoulders aren't hunched anymore. You're taking up space again." It was such a small thing to notice, but it felt enormous. A week later, she convinced me to join a watercolor class at the community center. I resisted at first, I had never been artistic. But something about the idea of creating without a defined purpose intrigued me. In the first class, my hands shook as I dipped the brush into blue paint. The color spread unevenly across the page, imperfect and alive. For the first time in years, I did not feel like I was failing at something. I felt like I was beginning. I went back every week after that. My paintings were not good, but they were mine, and that mattered more than I could explain. When I wasn't painting, I took long walks by myself. Sometimes I would sit in the park with a book I never opened, just watching the world move. I started cooking again, not because anyone expected it of me, but because I loved the smell of garlic and rosemary filling the kitchen. I would bake small loaves of bread and give them to Nora's neighbors. They began to call me the bread lady, and for once, it did not bother me to be known for something kind. Richard called about a month after I had left. His voice was flat, polite. "Have you scheduled a time to get your things?" he asked. "I already took what I needed," I said. A pause followed. "So you're really not coming back?" "I'm not," I replied. He sighed. "After all these years, you're just walking away?" "No," I said quietly. "I walked away a long time ago. You just didn't notice." He did not call again for a while. But a few weeks later, he sent a text. "Where are the tax files?" "In the cabinet under the printer," I replied. He didn't thank me. He never did. It was not bitterness that I felt, but a strange sadness for the man who still did not understand what he had lost. But the world has its own way of balancing things. One day, Daniel called. His voice was careful, as if he wasn't sure if I would pick up. "Mom," he said, "Dad showed me something. Your journal. Parts of it." I froze. "He shared that with you?" "Yeah," he said softly. "At first, I was angry you left like that. But after reading it, I get it now. I had no idea how bad it was." My throat tightened. "I never wanted you to feel caught between us." "I know," he said. "But I needed to know, and I think he did too." A week later, I received an envelope in the mail with Richard's handwriting on it. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a letter. "Evelyn. I don't know how to apologize for 40 years of missed chances, but I'll try. I read every page, every line. I saw what I didn't see before, the meals I never thanked you for, the kindness I took as habit, the woman I stopped choosing. I thought comfort was love. I thought quiet meant peace. I didn't realize it was your silence holding us together. I've signed over my share of the house and savings to you. Do with it what you will. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I finally see you. Richard. I read it twice, then again, not with anger, not with triumph, just with a quiet understanding that some truths arrive too late to fix anything, but not too late to matter. I did not write back. I did not need to. The apology was not for me to respond to, it was for him to live with. Grace called soon after. She sounded fragile. Dad showed me your journal too, she said. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't see it either. I thought your quiet meant you were fine. I did not know what to say. I just hope it's not too late for us, she added. It's not too late, I said gently. But I'm learning to take care of myself first. That has to come before everything else now. A month later, I visited the lake cabin my aunt had left me years ago. I hadn't been there in decades. It was small, with one bedroom and a porch overlooking the water, the walls smelling faintly of cedar and dust. But the moment I stepped inside, something in me exhaled. I spent the weekend cleaning, opening windows, and scrubbing floors. By the time I was done, the air felt alive again. I stood on the porch that evening watching the sunset turn the lake to gold, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. It wasn't happiness, not yet. But it was peace, the kind that comes when you stop explaining your pain to people who never listened. In the weeks that followed, I sold the house in town and moved to the cabin. With Nora's help, I built a small studio next to it, where I could paint and write. I started teaching weekend watercolor classes to women my age, most of them carrying their own quiet heartbreaks. We would paint, talk, and laugh softly. Sometimes we did not talk at all. That was okay, too. Life became quieter, simpler. I planted lavender near the porch steps, started baking again, and left my phone on silent more often than not. One evening, Grace came to visit alone. We cooked dinner together, pasta and salad, and afterward, she helped me plant a new row of herbs. As the sun set, she turned to me and said, "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." I smiled. I just stopped pretending I wasn't. After she left, I sat by the lake with my journal on my lap. The moonlight shimmered on the water. I dipped my feet in, the coolness spreading through me like something cleansing. I thought of my younger self, the woman who stayed too long, who mistook endurance for love. I wanted to tell her that she did not fail. She just believed too much in people who gave too little. I opened my journal and wrote, I didn't leave to be alone. I left to be whole. And now I'm not waiting to be chosen. I choose myself every day, in every breath. The wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a hummingbird darted past, pausing at the lavender blooms. The sound of the lake was steady, rhythmic, alive. I closed the journal, not because the story was over, but because I finally understood that I did not need to keep writing to prove I existed. I was already here, alive, enough.